Deputy Speaker. In October last year, I hosted the North Sydney Deliberative Democracy Forum on early childhood education and care. The event brought together 35 randomly selected but demographically representative members of our community with experts from academia and industry to discuss the affordability and accessibility of early childhood education and care services right across our country. Their goal was to arrive at a consensus on a policy approach they wanted to see the federal government pursue to ensure these services are affordable and accessible to everyone. There were lots of ideas that participants supported, including equalising the pay of early childhood educators with primary school educators and requirements to build early childhood education and care centres alongside new public primary schools. But the core of their final recommendation was that the government should provide universal free or low-cost early childhood education and care services to all children from birth, regardless of their family's financial circumstances. Well, I can't tell you how pleased I am then to say that with the Early Childhood Education and Care 3-day guarantee bill, the government is moving Australia towards my community's final recommendations and aspirations, and we could not be more pleased with this reform. I want to thank everyone who has fought so hard for it over many years. Indeed, when I first announced that I'd run as the independent candidate for North Sydney, it was people who were advocating in this area who were among the first to approach me to ask for my support, and as a consequence it was one of our key policy platforms during that campaign. This win, then, is not just for parents, but specifically for all children right across the country. And that's because this bill does two really important things. Firstly, it winds back the activity test to ensure that all families have access to 72 hours of subsidised care a fortnight, regardless of how many hours they work, study or volunteer. And this is what is known as the 3-day guarantee. At the same time, it allows families caring for Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander children, or those who work, train, study or volunteer for more than 48 hours a fortnight, to have access to 100 hours of subsidised care. And it's not an understatement to say this reform is incredibly important, as we've known for a long time that rather than acting as a stimulus for workforce participation, the activity test has been acting as a barrier, particularly for many lower-income families and families with irregular patterns of work. Indeed, the Economic Inclusion Advisory Committee itself has called the test poorly designed and punitive, highlighting the barrier it creates for many parents wanting to participate in the workforce. While research by the Australian Institute of Family Studies found no evidence, Mr Deputy Speaker, that the test had increased workforce participation. The Minister herself noted in her speech that in 2021, only 54% of children in the most disadvantaged areas were enrolled in early childhood education and care, compared with 76% in the highest socioeconomic areas, whilst an analysis from the Impact Economics and Policy found removing the activity test could allow around 126,000 children from lower-income families to access early childhood education. Ultimately, although ostensibly designed to encourage work, the activity test has failed, instead excluding many struggling families from access to early childhood education and care for no substantial gain. For this reason, countless researchers, peak bodies, committees and indeed many on the crossbench have been calling for the end of this test for years. As Georgie Dent, the CEO of Parenthood, says, removing the activity test is the most significant step towards creating truly universal education and care. At the heart of the problem with the activity test is the fact that it places the focus on the parents, when ultimately many, including myself, argue the focus should be on children and ensuring every child, regardless of their circumstance, has the same opportunities from the earliest days of their life. With all that said, I acknowledge some people are struggling to understand why those who ostensibly can afford to pay for it will not be charged under this new reform. But I'm comfortable the reform is absolutely the right thing to do, as it essentially aligns our attitudes and the attitudes we have always espoused as a nation when it comes to public education. As someone herself who was educated through the public system, I am so proud of that attitude and I will defend it to the death knell. As ultimately, I do not believe that a level of educational care a child receives should be based on an accounting declaration, nor should we as a society aspire to create a two-tier system where those who can afford to pay get access to some form of high-end silver-plated service, while those relying on a public assistance are only offered a white-label experience. And indeed, as I said, as someone who was public school educated through the 70s and 80s, I think that's what we've created on other levels of education, and we should wind that back and get it right from early education and care. No public school asks you how much your parents work before letting you in the door. Rather, it's accepted that no matter where you live or what you live in or what your parent does, every child in Australia needs and deserves access to an education without having to crunch numbers about their parents' circumstances. But this does represent a major philosophical shift in our approach to early childhood education and care. And some who may have either made a lot of money in this space or who just think some people have too much and therefore should be paying for it will be uncomfortable with what I've just said. So I accept it may take time for everyone to convalesce around the idea, even though I think it's brilliant. Having grown up in a regional community, however, and now representing the wonderfully vibrant and diverse community, I believe communities are their strongest when environments that surround our kids expose them to all sorts of people, to those that have and those who do not have. In addition to all of that, however, this bill will also bring us further in line with countries like Italy, Sweden, South Korea, Germany and others, who already operate more universal systems for early childhood education and care, and we know their systems work. In Germany, for example, researchers found the expansion of the government's childcare system to children aged 1 to 3 significantly improved the socio-emotional development of less advantaged children. And in the Nordic countries, which have generous and robust early education and care systems, they consistently rank as the best places in the world to raise children. But of course, the bill doesn't fix everything. For one thing, the sector has and is still facing a workforce crisis, losing workers to primary education and other careers due to the fact that this work is historically poorly paid and supported. And while the recent pay rise legislation is a welcome improvement, we do still need to ensure we're investing in workforce training and development and improving working conditions on an ongoing basis. As it currently stands, around 1 in 4 Australians live in a childcare desert, with services few and far between. Now, this leaves many families completely unable to access care for their children, which adds to their overall struggles. And this inequity is particularly stark in some regional areas. In this context, then, I support the efforts to build early childhood education and care centres, especially in rural and regional areas, and to continue to work with communities and not-for-profits to ensure every town has access to the services its citizens need, regardless of whether there is 5, 15 or 500 kids in the area. And finally, although subsidies are important, the out-of-pocket costs for many families, including those in my community of North Sydney, continue to be far too high and often prohibitive. Moving towards a truly universal system with a low out-of-pocket cost for 5 days of education and care without any form of activity requirement will take some work, but it's work that's worth doing. Ultimately, I'm only one of literally thousands of voices that have been calling for these changes to early childhood education and care, and I feel for the families that have been struggling to afford these services for years while they waited for the government to act. And I also was so drawn to this point of argument because as a mum of 3 kids of her own, I really struggled when they were young to get them into the services that they needed. But whether it is here in this place or the wider community, I'll continue to fight for this reform, as while this is an excellent start, we should go further. In closing then, I want to thank everyone who has engaged so passionately about this issue over the past 3 years. To my community, who know all too well the challenges of high costs, thank you for sharing your stories and for being prepared to advocate for a program that sought to remove any barriers for any child or family based on income, location or class. I encourage you to see this as a positive reform and to ensure that no matter the way the election goes in 2025, you back the people that are prepared to deliver this. To the participants of the North Sydney Deliberative Democracy Forum, thank you for transforming the community's values into policy recommendations. To the researchers and advocates, thank you for fighting so tirelessly for the reforms. This win is yours. You deserve to bask in it. But finally, to the Minister for Early Education, the Minister for Youth and Minister assisting the Minister for the National Disability Insurance Scheme, the Honourable Dr Anne Ali, thank you for finally bringing this to life. I have no doubt that having a cabinet that finally has equal representation by both men and women has been instrumental in getting this reform done. So please, keep up the good work.